One of the big topics that we look at in the 1920s and the effect of the First World War had on Canada was what was the Winnipeg General Strike. So recall, one of the main objectives that we do and want to learn and understand from learning about the First World War was how did the war change Canada? That's why we start off by looking to the Victorian, the British Empire, and basically the Great Transformation time, the 1890s of Canada, all the way up to the events of the war. But then what was life like then once the war was finished? Or at that time, it was referred to as the Great War, the war to have ended all wars. So let's get started. Now, the background to the Winnipeg General Strike was at the end of the World War I, the situation for the working people was very, very difficult because profiteering and inflation, society has struggled to go back to a non-wartime structure. There was also the Chinook affair. The cost of living had risen by over 50% since even before the war had started. But despite the cost of inflation, wages had only risen by 18%. And therefore, it actually was harder for Canadians to support themselves, let alone their families, once the war was over, before the actual war had began there. It was another kind of a struggle. And this was not what the people along the trenches were fighting for. And with the trenches, there was issues for the returning soldiers. While the drop in demand for goods happened because factories were laying off workers because the war was over. There was rising levels of employment, and soldiers who were returning home had no job to come back to. There was essentially no plan in place of how the people that fought in the war, how they can be reintegrated back into society there. And also, they were pretty sure the businesses have been making lots and lots of money off of the privateering situation with things such as that Ross rifle. What this all leads to is anger, a lot of anger all around. On top of that, there was the revolution in Russia that created a communist country, and there was growing sense of wanting to create labor movements. And a labor movement is essentially when organizers are trying to get a fairer and better deal for the workers. And originally, to achieve this goal, they wanted to have one big union. While that's happening, there was a Spanish flu. Unfortunately, what we learned about COVID in recent times, the Spanish flu was a deadly flu that swept across the world in the first couple of years after the war. The actual origins of the flu is controversial and complex, as there's many different origin stories. But what is known is that it might have come from the trenches. There was 4 waves, and the city of Winnipeg was hit especially hard because it was the hub of the entire railway network system in Canada. Grand Trunk, CN Railway, CP Railway. Winnipeg was that hub. And so Winnipeg would have been the real epicenter of the global pandemic of the Spanish flu. Now, what the workers want was to have the acceptance of collective bargaining by their employers. The union wanted to be able to negotiate a better contract on behalf of the workers, instead of the workers negotiating for themselves. This is a left-wing design. Now remember, in Russia in 1917, the Bolsheviks had revolted against the Tsar, the Russian king, killed him and his family, and taken over the government. Russia left the war and became a communist country. And for the Canadian business, this was a very scary idea. Because what Canadian business really thought was that they thought the union leaders might want to have a similar revolution by overthrowing the Canadian government and overthrowing the business. They wanted to have a communist revolution. And Uncle Joe, or Stalin, was now the leader of the country. The actual name of Stalin is actually really hard to pronounce, but essentially the word Stalin means man of steel. There was just a lot of fear and concern because one thing was known is that communists believed that change can only happen through violent struggle and bloodshed. The aristocracy, the the markets, everything needs to come down in chaos in order for the people to be liberated. So all in all, there's a massive layer and atmosphere of distrust and suspicion. And remember, as a review, right, a union is when there's a collection of workers or professionals who come together to negotiate a better working contract, better working conditions. And how that is usually achieved is by having a CBA, a collective bargain agreement, where everyone who's part of the union would have the same contract, the same salary, the same deal. If you think about today, there are lots of examples of CBAs like the NHL, the football, soccer, BC ferries, Translate. These are all some examples of places that have unions and a CBA contract between the employer and the employees, the owners and the athletes. So how the Winnipeg General Strike started was first it was the metal workers in the rail yards who started making demand. They wanted to have a raise in their salary of 85 cents an hour. They wanted a decrease of work from 60 hours down to 44 hours. And they will go on strike for it. Strike is when you are legally allowed to refuse to work until you have a new contract. Striking is the main weapon that a union has. Now, general strike is when other unions will go on strike. The other unions will join the picket line to refuse to do the work in solidarity and in support of the union that does not have it. Now, generally, general strikes have not happened all that much in Canada, but when a general strike does happen, its impact is felt tremendously. How it all went down. On the 15th of May, 1919, 30,000 people walked off the job in Winnipeg. The strike spread from industry to industry, and eventually by noon, most of the city of Winnipeg, the railway hub, had been shut down. Mail, streetcars, newspapers, garbage collection, phones, even milk delivery drivers had all walked out on strike in support. There was a central strike committee. Another committee of 1,000 people were struck up. There was additional sympathy strikes starting to appear in other parts of the country. This made the federal government and business leaders incredibly worried because this was how the revolution in Russia got started. So what resulted? On Bloody Saturday, June 26, the strike was stopped. 6 weeks in. The Northwest Mounted Police charged into the crowd and forcibly dispersed them, arrested, and detained those. For the strike, in short, was a disaster for the workers, jailed and blacklisted. Union organizers were discredited. But on the other hand, the workers did learn one important lesson, and that was their cause was just, the issues and grievances were for real, but instead of going on strike to get their grievances, their demands met, use the Canadian political system, use the legal system as well to achieve their goals, which is better salary, shorter hours, and better working conditions. And that was the real significance of the Winnipeg General Strike.